Hello everyone! In this lesson, we are going to update our front-end overlay JavaScript to use our new custom API URL that we've been building. So let's jump right into the action, and in our text editor, within our theme folder, let's look inside our JS or JavaScript folder. And then inside our modules folder, let's hop into our search.js file. And if we scroll down to our method that is named getResults, we see that here's the code we wrote when we were using the built-in WordPress API URLs. And because the default API URLs only work with one post type at a time, back when we wrote this code, we had to make two separate JSON requests, right? One for posts and one for pages, and then we manually smushed together the results. Well, a lot has changed since then. We've now created our own custom API URL that returns data for all 6 post types. So that means we really don't need this old setup any longer. However, I don't want to just outright delete this code immediately right now because there's still little bits and pieces from it that we can copy and paste to save additional typing. So here's what I'm going to do. Right above this line, so right at the beginning of our getResults method, I'm going to add a comment. And I'm just going to say, delete this code a bit later on. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, we can go ahead and delete all of this old code. But for now, we can leave it here for reference. And now, right above this, let's just write it the new way that uses our new custom API URL. So we no longer need to worry about the synchronous versus asynchronous topic because we no longer need to make multiple getJSON requests. So up on our new line of code, we no longer need to use the when-then combo. Instead of that, we can simply just make one request. So let's say $sign to use jQuery, and then let's use the getJSON method. It takes 2 arguments. The first is the URL that you want to send a request to. Let's just say X as a placeholder. And the second argument is a function that you want to run once the server or URL responds. So let's just supply an anonymous function here. And whatever JSON data this URL responds with will be passed into this function. So within these parentheses, we want to be sure to include a parameter that can receive the incoming data. So you could call it data or response. You can make up whatever parameter name you want. Just to make sense, I'm going to call it results. Okay, now we can use that within the body of this function. Before we move on though, I do want to be sure to use an ES6 arrow function. So that way the value of the this keyword will not be modified within this function. So remember to use an ES6 arrow function, you can just get rid of the word function, keep your parentheses in your parameter, and then right after it, you include =, greater than. Okay, now within the function, what do we actually want to do? We want to modify the HTML of our search overlays results div. So we know that we've got a property that we can access by saying this.results div, and right after this we can just target its HTML. And remember that instead of supplying a simple string of text, if we use backticks instead of single quotes, then we can create a template literal, which means we are free to drop down to multiple lines just like we would in normal HTML. Okay, and this time around, I don't want to begin just by outputting a heading level 2. Instead, I want to create a 3-column layout. So let's do this. Within our template literal, let's create an overall div, and let's give this a class of row. Okay, and then within this div, let's create 3 children div where each one is a column. So we can just say div, and let's give this inner div a class of 1/3 to represent a column that takes up 1/3 of the available width. Okay, and then you can just copy and paste that so that you've got 3 of them. Within our first column, let's drop down within the opening and closing divs. And within that div, let's add a heading level 2 that reads general information. All right, and then in our second column, let's drop down and let's add a heading level 2 that reads programs. And then right below that, we can have another heading level 2 that reads professors. In just a moment, we can output the actual list of results. So the resulting programs can go right underneath this headline, and the resulting professors can go right underneath this one. Okay, and then finally, in our third column, let's drop down in between the opening and closing div tags, and let's output a heading level 2 for campuses. And then below that, we can have another heading that reads events. Now, in terms of CSS and styling, I want to make sure that these headlines use the appropriate font size and color. So if we scroll down just a bit, within our old code, we can see that we were giving this heading level 2 a class of search overlay section title. So in order to save a bit of typing, why don't we just copy and paste this class name, copy that, and then back up in our new code, I'm just going to paste that in as the class for all of our heading level 2s. So on this first general information one, let's say class equals, and then paste it in. And you could actually just copy and paste the entire class attribute equals that. Copy that, and then you can just paste it in for all of the others. All right, and before we save this and test it out in the browser, let's first not forget about our X placeholder that needs to be a URL, right, that we want to send a request to. So to avoid a ton of typing, if we scroll down to our old code, here we are using the getJSON method, so we can just copy and paste this first argument. So it begins with university data, and if you scroll to the right, we want to select all the way up until val and then the closing set of parentheses. So let's copy that, and then back up in our new code, we can paste it in to get rid of this placeholder X here. And now before we save this, we do need to modify the namespace and the route. So WP-JSON is still correct, but then instead of WP-V2, we want to use our namespace. So let's delete that, and instead ours is university/V1. Okay, and then finally for the route, instead of posts, we created a route named search, and then the URL parameter that we used is term instead of search. Okay, and then we're just setting that to equal whatever the user has typed in. All right, and now we are actually just one step away from being able to delete our old code. So how about we do this? Within our new code, in the first column, right underneath this heading level 2, let's output a little bit of code that loops through the general information results, which are any resulting blog posts or pages. Now we've already written the code that does that, so if we just scroll down to our old code, and we see that here is our old heading level 2, and right below it are the lines that will generate HTML for each result. So why don't we just copy and paste these 3 lines of code into our clipboard, and then back up in our new code, in our first column right underneath the H2, let's just paste that in. And now, instead of checking to see if an array named combined results exists, or I should say has a length that is larger than 0, instead of checking for this, let's delete combined results and instead look for results.generalinfo. If you're wondering how I came up with this name, let me refresh your memory. So results is the name of the parameter that our function is using. It contains all of the JSON that the server or URL is going to send back. And then I'm looking inside results for an array named generalinfo. And this is just a name that I made up in our previous lesson. So for example, within our theme folder's INC folder, if you jump into searchroute.php, remember we created an array named results, and within it we have our subarrays. And the array that's going to contain blog posts and pages is named generalinfo. So that's what I'm looking for here. Let's do the same thing on this next line of code. So instead of combined results, we're looking for results.generalinfo. And the same thing on this line, results.generalinfo. Cool. Now at this point, we can go ahead and delete our old code. We no longer need it as a reference. So if I scroll down, here's that comment, delete this code a bit later on, and I'm just going to select from the beginning of that all the way down until this closing curly bracket, parentheses, and semicolon that comes right after this line where we're outputting our error message. Okay, so with this selected, let's delete that. And at this point, let's save this and test it out in the browser. You'll want to be sure that in your command line, you either run gulp scripts for a one-time compile, or run gulp watch, which will automatically trigger anytime you save a change to this file. Okay, so over on the front end, if I open the overlay and search for biology, whoops, we actually see undefined here. And that's just because in our code, for that link text, we are currently looking for a subproperty named rendered that belongs to a property named title. Now this is the structure that a default REST API URL uses, but if we check out Postman on our custom URL, you'll remember that our title simply lives in a property named title. It isn't nested in a subproperty named rendered. So back in our code, let's just delete this .rendered. And while we're at it, let's also address the link, the href value, because a default REST API URL uses a property named link, but in our custom URL in JSON, we made up a custom property named permalink. So in our code, let's change this from link to permalink. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And then back in the browser, if I search for biology again, cool, there's biology is cool, and the link successfully takes me to that blog post. However, you might remember that we wanted blog posts to say the title, by, and then the author name. Now the reason we are no longer seeing this is because in our code, we are checking to see if the current result has a property named type and if it equals post. And only then do we want to output by the author name. However, if we look at the custom JSON that our new URL is outputting, we don't have a property named post type. We only have title and permalink. So right now, why don't we go ahead and adjust the JSON that our custom URL outputs? Let's add a property here named post type. So to do that, back in our text editor, within our INC folder, let's jump into searchroute.php. And if you scroll down a bit, down to where we begin our while loop, within this first if block, we are saying if the current result is a blog post or a page, then do this. Generate a new array that gets pushed on to the end of this array. So within this associative array that we're building, let's just include another property. So right after this permalink line, let's say comma, and then we could make up whatever property name we want. Why don't we call it post type? And let's set that to equal get post type. Okay, now if I save that and refresh Postman, cool, now we can see that any results that live inside the general info array will contain a post type property. So now back in our JavaScript, this code that checks for a property named type, let's just change that to look for a property named post type, or whatever name you just made up in the PHP file. Now if this is the case, and if it's a blog post, then we're going to want to output the author name. And obviously, we just looked at our JSON, it does not include a property named author name. So let's just add one really quick. So back in our searchroute.php, right after this post type property that we just added, let's say comma, and let's create a property named author name, and let's set it to equal get the author. And then if we save that and refresh Postman, perfect. We've got a new property, author name. So now back in our front end JavaScript, this will successfully find the data that it's looking for. So let's go ahead and save this. And then on the front end, let's test it out again. Perfect. Biology is cool by Brad. And now we can just start working on outputting the results for these different headlines or these different content types. For programs and campuses, those can use the generic text styling like posts and pages. But for professors, I want to show a little photograph of the professor, and then I want to overlay their name on top of that image. And for events, I want to use the same styling that we see on the home page, right? With the circle, with the date, and then a brief description to the side of that. So we can work on that custom formatting for professors and events in the next lesson, but while we are still in this lesson, let's go ahead and set up the results for programs and campuses. So back in our code, in our front-end JavaScript, before we output the results for programs, why don't we actually scroll down to the bottom of this template literal HTML. And right after this line where the template literal closes, right after that, let's not forget to say this dot is spinner visible and set it to false. So that way, if someone wants to perform another search, as soon as they start typing, they will see the spinner icon. Okay, now back to the task at hand. Let's output any results that are of the program's post type. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We can just reuse this template literal loop code. So I'm just going to copy these 3 lines of code, and then right underneath the programs heading level 2, paste it in. Only this time, instead of looking within results for a subarray named general info, I'm going to look for an array named programs. And be sure to do the same thing on this line and this 3rd line. Also, this time around, when it comes to programs, we do not want the text that says by the author name. So right after the title and right after the closing A tag, I'm just going to delete this ternary operator that checks for the post type and then tries to output the author name. Now if I go ahead and save this, and then back on the front end, if I search for biology again, we should see a program. Yep, there it is. Now let's do the same thing for campuses. So back in our front end JavaScript, let me just copy these 3 lines again. Okay, and then right underneath the heading level 2 for campuses, we can just paste that in. Let's be sure to update which subarray we are looking within. So instead of programs, campuses, do the same thing for these 2 references as well. Give that a save. And now if I search for one of the campus names that I know I have, which is Downtown West, cool, there we have it. Now before we bring this lesson to a close, let's not forget about the little message we see if nothing matches for that post type. So this message makes sense under general information, but under programs we forgot to update the message. So it still says no general info matches that search. So back in our text editor, underneath the program section, if we scroll to the right, here we see no general info matches that search. Let's change this. Instead of general info, let's say no programs match that search. And then even after that sentence, we could say view all programs and then make that a link to the programs page. So we could wrap this text in an HTML tag and then give the opening tag an href attribute and set it to /programs. And that would work in most cases, but again, not all WordPress installs are located at the root of a domain. So to make this flexible, what we can do is, instead of outputting a quote here, see how this begins with single quotes, let's change that to a backtick so we can create a template literal. So at the very end of this line, let's also change this single quote into a backtick, just a single backtick. And now right before the /programs, right before the slash, let's open up a JavaScript expression. And within the curly brackets, let's say university data dot root URL. So if I save that and then search for the Downtown West campus again, perfect. No programs match that search, and then a link to view all programs. Now let's do the same thing for campuses. If there are no campus results, we want a custom message. So back in our code, I'm just going to copy and paste this A tag that we just set up to avoid a lot of extra typing. So copy that. And then if we scroll down to the campuses area, let's just update this. So instead of general info, let's say no campuses match that search. And then before I paste in my clipboard here that contains a template literal, I'm going to update these single quotes to backticks. Okay, then right here I can paste in my clipboard and change the end of the URL from programs to campuses and say view all campuses. Give that a save, and now if I search for biology, perfect. No campuses match that search. with a convenient link to view all campuses. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next one.